Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. I believe we already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Plum Stone, founder of the Safer Air Project in Australia. Plum is a policy and public affairs professional who has specialised for the last decade in cancer and social inclusion in terminal illness policy. It is this policy and patient advocacy experience, coupled with Plum's own chronic health condition experience, that led her to found the Safer Air Project. People living with chronic illness have always faced access and inclusion challenges, including exposure to poor indoor air quality that can exacerbate their health conditions. These risks, which have increased since the pandemic, are not broadly recognised by society, marginalising many people and highlighting a serious gap in our approach. Viewing indoor air quality through the lens of access is a profound change in perspective, and one that potentially holds the key to unlocking better outcomes for society at large. We discuss her story and journey to found the Safer Air Project, the impact lack of access to schools, healthcare, the workplace, and more has on people with long-term health conditions, and how access to a group that is often described as the other can improve our built environment for everyone. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes. This is a conversation with Plum Stone. It's unusual for the podcast. We usually have this format where we'd like to start with a big question and then at some point talk to the guest about how they kind of ended up here in this space. But I think from our previous conversation, I think it's important with the how you ended up here question at the beginning, because I think it so beautifully frames the importance of something like the Safer Air Project. So that's kind of the first question. Like, Plum, how did you end up here, you know, as a founder of the Safer Air Project?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. So my background is in health policy and public affairs. In 2004, I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on SARS and flu pandemics and how we can learn the lessons of the past to prepare for pandemics of the future. I then did a master's in public health, and I worked for a shadow health minister in the UK Parliament, and then found myself working in global public affairs agencies on health policy programs. And I've always just been fascinated by the role of health policy in solving health problems. So in 2010, you can't tell from my accent, but I'm actually Australian. And in 2010, I moved back to Australia, and I, again, was working in global public affairs agencies before I ended up working for a charity called Rare Cancers Australia as their head of policy and public affairs. And so again, I became a really sort of specialist policy expert in rare cancers and the challenges of that people with rare cancers face in terms of equity of access to cancer medicines, equity of access to care. For many people living with rare cancers, they have to self-fund access to cancer medicines that if they had a common cancer, they would get through would be government subsidies. And then at the sort of start of the pandemic, I was living in the UK. I was working for Marie Curie, who are a large terminal illness charity, on a program focusing on social inclusion in end-of-life care. And it was really there. We were living in the UK. That my kind of professional experience collided with my personal experience. We were infected super early in the pandemic. I lost my sense of taste and smell for 2 weeks. And 10 days into that infection, my daughter, who was 3.5 years old at the time, suffered a prolonged status epilepticus seizure. It was 25 minutes before the ambulance arrived. It was another 20 minutes before they gave her a buckle that eventually stopped the seizure. And it was then 4 hours before she woke up. And I didn't know if she was ever going to wake up or what the deficits might exist.
Yeah.
And this was all before we went into lockdown. And as we kind of
Yeah.
headed into lockdown, the narrative was around people with chronic health conditions, being at particularly increased risk. Well, my daughter and I were, in inverted commas, previously healthy. We didn't have any known risk factors for poor health outcomes, but my husband has a stage 4 chronic kidney disease. And it's an autoimmune condition, so he's severely immunocompromised and he requires a transplant. So suddenly, here we were kind of headlong charging into a pandemic, and my professional brain was going, oh, this is really interesting from a policy perspective, and it was just fascinating to me. But also suddenly we had this really acute family risk. And
Yeah, and casting our minds, I mean, it's hard sometimes, I think, to cast our minds back to, this must have been
this is sort of
20,
March, April 2020. Yeah.
yeah, like there was a lot of fear around then. We didn't know the direction this was heading in. We didn't understand how to control the respiratory failures that were occurring from
Yeah.
COVID. We were a long way from even deciding it was airborne at that stage. It's hard sometimes, but I just wanted to kind of set that frame that everything you've been
Yeah.
talking about before with public health and working the ministers was all pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
And now you find yourself as a family having gone through a really traumatic event of having to deal with COVID with your daughter so severely, and now starting to recognize that members of your family are also vulnerable
Yeah.
to this disease. Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
It was really difficult, and as we had, we kind of headed into lockdown, I also started to develop symptoms, neurological symptoms, cardiovascular symptoms. I woke up one morning and I'd been sleeping on my left side. I had my 15-month-old baby in bed with me. I'd been sleeping on my left side, cuddling him, but the whole of my right side of my body was numb, had kind of pins and needles, and it was a really terrifying. I remember it so clearly. And that was really the start of a journey for me that in 2020 and 2021, I was told I was just anxious. But actually, we now know they're symptoms of long COVID. And I've been living with those symptoms now for 5 years. So even for people with pre-existing, there's obviously the risk for people with pre-existing health conditions from airborne infection, but also there's a risk of people developing chronic health conditions who don't have known risk factors. And I really, because of my professional brain and my personal experience, I just kind of became fascinated. Well, hang on a second. How is this disease transmitted? Oh, okay, it's airborne. And obviously, and exactly as you said, there was a lot of discussion around that. And I don't know if you've read, Lydia Morovska wrote a paper, The Science Rejected, Lives Lost, in 2023. And it really clearly details the work that she and other scientists were doing at the time with the WHO to get that recognition of airborne. And we lost so much time. And we lost so many lives because, for exactly those reasons. It was, we weren't on the front foot saying this is an airborne disease. We need airborne protections. We need to clean the air.
I remember plainly at the time, I had just been pulled into an advisory group in Ireland at the same time the SAGE groups were setting up in the
Yes.
UK. We had an equivalent in Ireland called NEFIT, and I was on an advisory group around ventilation and air quality. And I'll never forget, it became a battle of words. It became a battle of how you describe something as being airborne. And the medical community had one description of it, and the scientific community had another description of
Yeah.
it. And quite frankly, anybody with any common sense had a plain English understanding of it, and that is, well, if I'm in a room and I can get it by breathing it in, doesn't that mean it's airborne? It was it was just this weird moment for 6 to 9 months in some
Yeah.
parts of the world where there was this battle of people going, isn't it airborne?
Well, and even it's a battle that's kind of ongoing now. It's still something that we're grappling with. I mean, back to the conversations that you were having. So I was at that stage at the plain language level, because this was not a policy area that I had previously delved into. But I very quickly became super interested in, well, HEPA filters, CO2 monitoring, N95 masks, like all of these things, all of these tools that we have that we can use to protect ourselves, that we can use to make the air safe for everyone to breathe. And sort of rather naively, I think I assumed that we would take the opportunity, during those lockdowns, to actually put provisions in place to make sure that when we emerged from lockdown, we would have made the air safe. And then we didn't. And so in sort of July 2021 in the UK, Boris Johnson had his Freedom Day. But actually for families like mine who have chronic health conditions, this was a very alarming time, because we hadn't made provisions to make school safe. We hadn't made provisions to make workplaces safe. We certainly hadn't made provisions to make accessing healthcare safe. And suddenly the risk was entirely on the immunocompromised person, and their family and carers, to protect themselves from an airborne virus that wasn't going to go away. And of course, it isn't just COVID that continues to pose a risk. Since public health measures were lifted, we've seen increases in influenza, RSV, measles, or human metapneumovirus, which is currently surging in China. So it's all of these airborne viruses that we could be tackling with one solution by cleaning the air. They're all a risk. And if you think about it from the perspective of say someone living with cancer, when a person with cancer is infected with a virus, whatever virus it is, there is a halt to their treatment, and the delays to cancer treatment lead to disease progression. Delays to treatment can be really harmful, and so why aren't we doing more to when I first joined Rare Cancers, we wrote a report called Just a Little More Time. For people with rare cancers, we're often not talking about curative treatment. We're talking about treatments that can extend life by months, in small increments. So what does it mean for people at that who have a condition when they are infected with a preventable disease, a preventable airborne infection? What does it mean to those precious few months that we're so desperately trying to achieve with high-cost cancer medicines? It seemed to me to be so completely at odds with what we're trying to achieve, that we would simply allow something that we can prevent from happening to occur, and to completely interrupt those very important months that people so desperately need to have. It just didn't make any sense to me, and it's still something that I really kind of grapple with. And ultimately, it was the combination of post Freedom Day, that realization that actually as a family we now faced an accessibility challenge. We now faced an accessibility challenge for school. We now faced an accessibility challenge for work, for healthcare. Well, we're not alone. Well, my family is not unique in this experience. And one of the things we looked at, and this is sort of getting into really, Safer Air project being formed. My experience was in cancer policy. 1.2 million Australians are living with a past or current diagnosis of cancer. Well, with a population of 27 million, it's not a small proportion. The Australian Bureau of Statistics says that 49% of Australians are living with at least one chronic health condition. And okay, some of those are conditions like back pain. And I'm certainly not saying that people living with back pain have an increased risk of poor health outcomes from airborne infection. But conditions like asthma, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, cancer, cardiovascular disease, stroke, or these people living with these conditions actually make up a huge percentage of the population. And
Yeah.
so what happens when all of these people now face an increased risk of poor health outcomes because of an infection? And it just became very frustrating. I mean, I basically haven't slept a lot in the last 5 years because I've done a lot of, that's when I do kind of most of my thinking. And I just lay awake kind of wondering, well, if this isn't a problem that's unique to us, it's something that a lot of people are experiencing. And we've made steps. We have various, vehicles for accessibility and inclusion. We've made, if my child was in a wheelchair, the school would be accessible. If my child was was neurodiverse, the school would be accessible. There would be things that would be put in place to ensure that my child could safely access their education. But
Yeah.
how come for an immunocompromised child we're facing pushback from education providers on making the air safe and accessible? And it was one of those things, one of those thoughts that sort of I really wasn't able to kind of put back into the box.
Yeah. So I want to kind of consolidate that framing in my own mind, if you don't mind. We have this period of time where the world suddenly decides to move on from COVID collectively, right? And it happened largely globally within a period of 3 to 6 months. Like the world suddenly decided we're done with that. It's cost us too much money. We're off. And it pulls the rope ladder up on the ship and goes, right, we're off. And there's a whole section of the community stood there looking at this ship going, hang on a minute. Like this isn't over for a section of society. And I made a note there, people are vulnerable. And this was the other framing I wanted to try and put forward. This is a problem of the built environment. People, they didn't and don't get sick from COVID outside in the park, but much as we banned people from the park at the beginning when we didn't really know what we were doing. But this is a problem of the built environment. And the reason this is an accessibility issue is, as Kath Noakes, who was, from Leeds and a very prominent voice during the time, and an engineer, importantly, said, what COVID asked of us was not whether buildings were a problem or not. What did we actually know about the buildings that we own and manage? And the answer to that question was sweet F all. That actually the answer that came back was, well, nobody's been paying any attention to ventilation and air quality in our built environment ever. So we don't know what our classrooms are doing. Frankly, we have no idea what our office spaces are doing, quite frankly, or our homes, or almost any other part of the built environment. In fact, even most parts of the medical sector, we didn't really know that most of our hospital environment is older buildings that are naturally ventilated. We came to that period of time where the rope ladder's being pulled up, and the reason people are being left behind is because our built environment was not prepared and is still not prepared to manage ventilation and infection risk in a way that includes everybody. And the final note I made here when we're framing this was, this isn't just about direct exposure to people that are vulnerable. This is the family members and close associates of people that are vulnerable this affects too. A child doesn't go to school and come home and infect somebody that they need a wheelchair as a result. But with COVID, that's the risk here. If you're not making buildings accessible to family members, the risk is that they become infected and bring that risk home to family members as well. So you're now left there in the UK looking at this environment where there's Freedom Day, which must still stick in your throat. I imagine.
It's awful.
Yeah, and thinking, hang on a minute, like vast swathes of the built environment. I don't know if you even had access as a picture in your mind yet, but you must have been stood there going, hang on a minute, large swathes of the built environment are off limits to me and my family now. Um,
Yeah.
what did you do? Like, what happens next when you're sitting there as somebody with all the skills and knowledge you've had about public health and working with governments, and you're stood in the UK and you're thinking, this is manifestly unfair. Like, this is a social justice problem here.
Yeah.
What happened next for you?
So obviously, sort of July 2021 was the kind of the Freedom Day, the lifting of all the brakes, and we were kind of left on our own. And obviously, we were still, still then, still are now, very conscious of the fact that any infection could have a significant impact on my husband's kidneys. But I've been reinfected since I've had two infections, one in November 2022, and it floored me because my long COVID, it just, I was taken out for 3-4 weeks, and it was awful. So that 2021, we were still super aware of the fact that although the rhetoric from government was this is over, it felt an awful lot like people were just burying their heads in the sand, because actually the collective trauma, it was just easier to pretend like it wasn't a thing, and to just move on. And so we headed back to school in September 2021, and I was already, had been in, in the terms previous to that, but I became very vocal about advocating for HEPA filters in our classrooms. And I was on the board of our nursery, our preschool nursery as well. So I was, advocating there for HEPA filters. I was successful in getting HEPA filters into our nurseries, which was great. But the experience with the primary school was, no, they didn't want to hear about it. School was safe. So by October 2021, there was no longer any testing requirements, there were no isolation requirements, and infectious children were allowed back in school. And I remember going on half term and thinking, what are we going to do here? This is an unacceptable level of risk. How are we meant to navigate this now, where my child could go to school and bring home an infection that could kill daddy? And I just, it felt insurmountable. And at the same time, Australia reopened its borders. And I said to my husband, we've got to go home. We've got to go back to Australia. And I mean, friends in the UK said, why are you going back to Australia? They'll do the same, they'll do the same thing. I was like, no, Australia is never going to abandon public health measures. And we got back here in December 2021, literally the week that Dominic Perrottet, who is the Premier for New South Wales, pulled the same Freedom Day for New South Wales, and it was really traumatizing. So we arrived back, and then we went through, the next few months were, deja vu, and I had exactly the same experience. My son was still in preschool, and my daughter was going back into primary. So I began advocating to the preschool and the primary for the HEPA filters. And I think maybe CO2 monitors, by that stage, I'd kind of learned about CO2 monitoring and the opportunities there as well. And the preschool accepted it gladly. It was at that stage, it was a 50 centimeter, box fan, Corsi Rosenthal box, which I bought. And, you mentioned Catherine Oakes earlier. I kind of credit all of my kind of learning around indoor air quality, to people like Kath, and to Richard Corsi and Kimberly Prather and all of these incredible scientists on Twitter. Those early kind of years on Twitter, where these incredible scientists were sharing the latest research and the latest innovations, was just, I feel very lucky that I had access to their knowledge through that. I built this giant Corsi Rosenthal box, and I put really big googly eyes on it, and because it was for a preschool, right? But the school didn't want to hear about it. The school was safe. So exactly the same language came out of the Australian primary school as came out of the UK, which I thought was really interesting. And I mean, obviously, I'm like a dog with a bone, right? There's a reason I founded a charity, because I can't put this
Yeah,
away.
but again,
But
I want to put people into that mental space, you know,
yeah,
and I am as guilty of it, and my family are as guilty of it as I think most of the population
mm,
was, and that was we couldn't wait to see the back of COVID,
yeah,
and there was a you know, if people can just reimagine what that drop in anxiety levels was like for people, where it was basically just classified now as another flu, and we were like, right, we can just get on with it. If we get it, I don't even want to do a test. If I've got a cough, or I just don't want to see, I don't want to
yeah,
stick another swab up my
yeah,
nose for as long as I live, right?
mm,
And so, and we'll talk about this later, but I think it really speaks to the heart of tolerable risk and
mm,
acceptable risk, that for the vast majority of the population, it suddenly became a tolerable risk,
yeah,
right? Um, Now imagine, for listeners to put themselves in your shoes, where that anxiety never went away, that risk never went away. And so now in 2025, you are still thinking about COVID and infection risk day to day in the same way that you were 2022.
yeah,
That's a
yeah.
powerful driver for doing what you did next, I guess.
I mean, for us, it's funny to think about it as people's anxiety levels dropping. For us, my anxiety level increased significantly,
Yeah,
because actually infectious children were now going to be in the classroom.
yeah,
And until that moment, our exposure had been very limited, because people were doing the right thing. They were isolating, they were testing, they were isolating. And now they're not. And now they don't care if the infection that they've got is COVID, flu, RSV, all of which, they're all consequential. Um, and so, yeah, my anxiety levels increased significantly, because actually suddenly there was even less that I could do to protect my family. And so when the school said, no, you can't have HEPA filters, I was just like, why? It doesn't make any sense, because improving indoor air quality, as you know, also improves. It doesn't just reduce infection risk. It actually improves cognitive functioning. Schools get better test scores. Why wouldn't schools want their children to get better test scores when the children don't even have to do anything? They just have to
yeah.
breathe. And and the sort of the stupidity of it all, just it was kind of mind blowing for me. I did eventually get HEPA filters into the primary school in June 2023, so 18 months later. And the reason that I was successful was because I used this analogy. I said to the principal, if my daughter was in a wheelchair, you would have made sure that not only her classroom, but the entire school was accessible. And so would the excursions be. The excursions would be accessible. Excursions currently are not accessible for us. The kids get on a bus. Buses have the worst ventilation. I don't know if you've ever put an Aranet on a school bus, but I mean, I've got readings, and it's included in the report that we published, where it's 3,500. Amy, my co-founder, sent her Aranet on a school bus with her daughter, and it was 8,800. I
Yeah,
mean, what are we doing?
thankfully, the horror of school buses is a long way behind me. But I still remember vividly what nasty environments they were, even back in that. Well, I won't even say when. But
Yeah,
like the reality is they're very small air conditioned boxes with a bunch of people breathing recirculated air. I mean, it's you couldn't make anything worse, you know.
no. So and then you put potentially one infectious child on a bus when you've got a ppm at 8,800. The chances of transmission are really high, and it really should be unacceptable. So yeah, it was when I raised that this was an accessibility issue with the school that they went, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way, and it was
Was
really
that a
kind of.
light bulb moment for you? Because I can
Yeah,
imagine you being in a position where you're going, like a lot of things, when you're trying to, where something is objectively nonsense, right? You've
Yeah,
got this scenario where there's this massive risk to the family.
yeah,
There's co-benefits for days for improving air quality on
yeah,
teachers,
yeah,
kids, visitors, you name it.
yeah,
Like it virtually no downsides to this
yeah,
for a cost that's inconsequential, really, and nothing's landing, and then you find yourself having an argument about accessibility. Is that the light bulb moment for you, where you go, "Hang on a minute, this is a fairness thing. Like,
yeah,
this is a public, this is a social justice thing. This is about access."
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so 2023 was when was awake thinking about accessibility and inclusion. And it was so obvious to me that our family faced an accessibility challenge for school. And for, by 2023, my husband had to give up his job. It involved an awful lot of international travel, and the risk was just too great. So hang on a second, how come you've got people having to quit their jobs because the workplace isn't safe? How come you've got children who are having to mask, to wear respirators in classroom, face bullying, and what just none of it kind of made sense. How come you've got cancer patients? You spoke about a family, where a school child brings the infection home and infects someone. That happened to a friend of mine. She'd been through 15 rounds of chemotherapy, was due a double mastectomy, and her son brings COVID home on the 15th round of chemo through no fault of his own, because he caught it in the classroom. And there's no blame. He was exposed. He should never have been exposed. But he brings it home. She catches COVID. The double mastectomy is then postponed because of the infection, with a really aggressive cancer. And that, I mean, I remember being deeply concerned when she told me, and this was, the just because we know delays to cancer treatment lead to,
bad
invariably lead to
outcomes.
progression.
Yeah,
And
and
anyway, she,
yeah, and speaking to you, like, this is not about eliminating risk, but when there's a clear contributor to risk in the built environment,
yep,
nobody is saying here that kids aren't going to bring home bugs from schools and infect families. I mean, schools are veritable petri dishes at the best of
yeah,
times. But when there's a known risk
mm-hmm,
that's causing an accessibility issue, like you say, in the same way that if a kid had visual impairment
yeah,
or hearing impairment, like, the school would fall over backwards to make sure that the right facilities and
mm-hmm,
mechanisms were in place in that child's education. We'd hope,
yeah,
anyway. I know that schools are massively underfunded, and I'm sure there are listeners screaming at the podcast, going, "No, no, yeah, I've been fighting for a ramp for my school for 9
yeah,
years or whatever." But so we know there's a problem there. But when there's a manifest risk that's causing an accessibility issue, um, and can significantly reduce the risk, which we believe it can, for
mm-hmm,
airborne, particularly for airborne diseases, um, just seems like a no-brainer.
yeah,
And this is what I think has been a really enlightening part of talking to you, Plum. I've been involved in air quality for 15 years, 20 years nearly at this stage. And God, I've been talking about air quality a lot in the last year or two with the podcast, as you can
yeah,
imagine. I have never viewed air quality from an accessibility
yeah, yeah,
perspective. And it's, if we're going to win this battle around air quality, we need all of the perspectives we
mm-hmm,
can. And it's amazing, there's so many different ways of viewing this challenge,
mm-hmm,
social injustice,
yeah.
health outcomes, public health, and so on. Accessibility is a very powerful argument, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and that is exactly why these sleepless nights eventually kind of led me to the decision that I couldn't sit back and watch these arguments for delivering mandated indoor air quality standards. Everybody sort of trying to work towards making the air safer, but without the lens of accessibility. My experience of working in cancer policy, if I want to make change to cancer policy, I go down to Canberra. I get a meeting with the minister and his advisors and various other MPs, and I take a patient with me so that they can hear the lived experience of the person living with cancer.
Yeah.
And for me, it just kind of seemed obvious that there wasn't the lived experience of the person with the chronic health condition being heard in the policy arguments for improving indoor air quality. And so the natural progression was to say, okay, well, cool, let's fill that gap. Let's found a charity with a vision to create a world where everyone can breathe safely indoors, and see if in doing so, if in bringing the sort of the patient voice and the personal perspective to the debate, we can make a difference. And so that's, it's certainly not the easy solution. Founding a charity is definitely not the easy solution. But I do firmly believe that that in bringing that voice to the conversation, we can try and sort of shift the dial, or at least kind of accelerate momentum towards our goal, which is to have safe indoor air quality standards that apply to all public spaces. So we founded the Safer Air Project late 2023. Seems weird to say that because now we're in 2025. We got our charity status, in April, and then in August 2024, the Australian Chief Science Officer published a report on the role of indoor air quality in viral transmission. And that report had been called for by Assistant Minister for Health, Jed Carney. And so that is where that report kind of came about. So Jed launched the report in August. And as she was launching it, she said in the presentation, so now we've got this report that clearly defines, the role of indoor air quality and viral transmission, and the tools and the technology that we already have that we can use to tackle this problem. And now we just need to kind of move forward on the policy and work out what the policy levers are. And I was sort of sitting in the launch going, I know what these are. It's accessibility. Accessibility is the reason why we need indoor air quality performance in all public spaces. If you take, for example, the Australian Disability Discrimination Act, it already applies to people living with chronic health conditions, and it says that all spaces should be universally accessible. And sitting alongside...
How would that practically apply today, outside of the air quality question? Like when you're saying buildings should be accessible to people with chronic health conditions, what does that? How does that manifest? Like, what's the road trodden, if you were, in that regard?
So I'm not sure that really to date it kind of focuses on chronic health conditions. I think it's more around accessibility for people who use wheelchairs, accessibility for people who are blind, who are deaf, through assistive audiology, braille, ramps, etc.
Yeah.
But the legislation explicitly states chronic health conditions, and therefore, in theory, it can be used for these purposes. We don't have to kind of look to create new legislation. It already should cover. But what no one has really done yet is kind of connect the role of indoor air quality in health and indoor air quality and accessibility.
Yeah.
But once you start to understand that indoor air quality has the potential to significantly impact the health and well-being of people who have chronic health conditions, and that they are disproportionately at increased risk of poor health outcomes from, and it can be exposure to airborne pathogens, but also other airborne pollutants, right? You know, asthma,
Yeah.
allergies, etc. Then you have to kind of think about it. Well, if that's an accessibility challenge, how do we solve it?
And
And
also, this is close to home for people. So, sorry to interject, but
but
you know, if you just take cancer for example, what is it? Everybody in their lives, 1 in 4 people at some point are going to have some
it,
form of cancer, right?
yeah, so in Australia, it's 1 in 2 people will be diagnosed with cancer before the age of
Right.
85.
So we are all a heartbeat and a relation away
Mm-hmm.
from somebody who's likely to be vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
and have an accessibility
Mm-hmm.
issue,
Mm-hmm.
whether we understand it well enough yet or not,
Mm-hmm.
in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Which means this is close to home for everybody. This
Yep.
isn't, you know, if we were saying, you know, in the next 50 years, 1 in 3 of you are going to end up in a wheelchair,
Yep.
you'd have ramps everywhere, right?
Yep.
And rightly so. We have been putting accessibility into most public spaces
Mm-hmm.
over the last decade or two for that very reason. But this is not some distant risk for us as people, you know, and even if it's not cancer, you could, for a period of time in your life, you could be vulnerable
Yep.
with something else like this. The risk is very real here, that all of a sudden places that you took for granted
Yep.
could be inaccessible for the reasons that we're talking about. That's profound.
And this is exactly it's that kind of light bulb moment of, oh my god, this is not a me, this is not a unique to my family, this is an everybody issue. We, off the back of the chief science officer's report, I got in touch with assistant minister for health Jed Carney's office, and I met with them the following week, and at the end of the meeting I said, I don't suppose the assistant minister would be interested in launching a report for us on indoor air quality as an accessibility issue. And she came back 2 days later and said yes. I was like, oh, okay, amazing. Well, now I've got to write it. But you know, that was pretty easy to do because obviously I'd spent so many sleepless nights. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and you know, I produced this kind of 15,000 words in about a week. You know, because I already had all of these arguments like fully formed, and one of them is this particular point around they are all of us. What happened at the start of the pandemic was people with chronic health conditions were othered. We were, and certainly in Australia, you know, even when we got back here in December 21, you know, there was still a daily press conference saying, you know, 66 people died. They all had chronic health conditions. And it was
Yeah.
kind of said in this way that was sort of meant to be reassuring to people that,
It's,
you know,
it's okay they were black. It's okay they were indigenous. It's okay they were in a wheelchair. Could you imagine? Like,
no,
it's
100%.
yeah,
It was really offensive to me. And in fact, someone said to me that, you know, a child had died, and we were talking about it, and they said, oh, but they had lots of pre-existing health conditions. And I exploded. I said, would you say that to my husband? If my husband died, would you say to me, it's okay he died because he had a pre-existing health condition? No, you wouldn't. But it was said from, you know, from the chief health officers and others, that as a way to kind of make people think that it's all right, you're not vulnerable. These people, and so the othering that occurred, it was, people were kind of led to believe, don't worry, they were palliative already, they were, you know, they were on death's doorstep. But
yeah, and
actually
that, you
we're
know,
not talking.
there's an element of truth in that. You know, in statistics, people are more likely to die from these things if they're vulnerable. It's true. You know, you will, you know, that in the stats, if you're saying it as it is, that's true, but doesn't make it right.
No.
And you know, and that's the thing. You know, we don't leave people behind
we,
because of
we don't we don't basically say, I'm sorry, you're 65 now, you're at increased risk, so here you're on your own. We don't say to someone, oh, you've got cancer now, we're going to leave you on your own, we're not going to try and tackle it, we're not going to try and treat it.
Yeah.
We
And look, this is not, and this is not us saying for a second that we should still be in lockdown or something crazy.
No, God no.
This is about us saying there is a manifest risk in the built environment, the boxes that we build for people, that those boxes are excluding a larger proportion of society than you might imagine.
Yeah.
Because we have to do something lofty, because we're not doing what we probably should have been doing all along anyway. And this is I talk about this ad nauseum on the podcast, and Kath's point about not knowing how these buildings are performing. That the reality is that a lot of the problem that we're dealing with these boxes that are excluding portions of society is we've not been getting what we've paid for in the first place.
Yeah.
That a lot of this risk would be reduced if the buildings were doing what they were supposed to.
Yep.
Anyway, and the society's penchant for running to failure ventilation and HVAC systems and buildings has got us to where we are, or this belief that just because there's a standard, the supply chain's going to deliver. We've found ourselves now with whole tranches of the built environment, education, healthcare, residential workplaces that aren't performing how they should be. So I then mention it because it's an important part here, that when we get animated talking about this, it feels a bit regressive in a way, that we're saying, oh no, we need to go back to the time when we were all sat in our gardens, not able to go anywhere. No, not even close. But this is about saying that we should have Freedom Day. But the reason we can't for a portion of society is because those buildings don't provide access to certain parts of society.
What we should have done in the time where we were sitting in our gardens is make indoor air quality safe, so that you reduce the level of transmission to the lowest practicable level. Yeah. And we could have done that. And in doing so, it wouldn't have just been COVID that would have had an impact. We'd have had an impact on flu. We'd have had an impact on RSV, on chickenpox, on measles, on all of these, airborne viruses. We'd have also had an impact on asthma and allergies, and we could have had an impact, and we also could have prepared ourselves for the next pandemic, which is knocking on our door. I mean, we're still in this pandemic. We're Australia. We're just in the in another crashing wave. We haven't come out of this one because we didn't do what we needed to do to make it go away, which was to make the air safe. We are therefore not prepared for the next one, which is a heartbeat away. And we're also not prepared for we're already in a climate crisis. Look at the fires in LA over the last couple of weeks. Australia, we know all too well the dangers of bushfires and the significant impacts on society. We are not ready. As the climate sort of crisis accelerates, we will move indoors more. The air indoors must be safe. So that what we really need to do is to kind of look very quickly at moving forwards on setting safe indoor air quality standards, so that as society moves indoors more as a result of climate change, as society kind of, we spend so much time indoors, the air should be safe. It should be safe for everyone. And be it because you already have a pre-existing health condition that makes you at significantly increased risk, or because you have a future health condition, or because exposure to the the pathogen or the pollutant today creates a health condition. I didn't have a health condition. I was before I was infected with COVID. Now I live with cardiovascular and neurological symptoms that are really quite debilitating.
I'll have you back to the podcast in just a minute, but I wanted to tell you briefly about Imbiate, a partner of the podcast. I came across Imbiate a while ago, and in fact, completely unrelated to the podcast, had been trying out some of their sensors here in my office, which I still have here today, and with customers. I was seriously impressed then and remain so. Imbiate are a multidisciplinary team with a common goal to promote healthy and sustainable interior spaces. They manufacture smart indoor air quality monitors and an exceptional cloud platform. Look, I get to see and use many products, as you could imagine, and Imbiate stands out here. The quality of the product, the innovation they bring with sensors and connectivity options, and a platform with some unique approaches to reporting and integration with many of the reference standards in the sector like Reset, Well, Lead, and others. Their devices can also be integrated to any building to control and automate the operation of HVAC systems, ensuring optimal air quality and energy savings. Details are in the show notes as always, and at airqualitymatters.net and at Imbiate. That's INBIOT.ES. Now, back to the podcast. Yeah,
Yes.
and it may not even be an infection risks that gives you that chronic health condition. You could be
Yeah.
exposed to poor air quality that gives you cancer or lung cancer or kidney disease or anything. You know, we now know that air quality impacts every organ of the body.
Yeah.
So it's a chronic health condition waiting to happen, that poor
Absolutely.
environment as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So where's the Safer Air project today? You released the report, and I will share that in the notes. And what struck me about the report was both its clarity in its positioning, but also in its storytelling and the people at the heart of it. It was quite a unique report in it brought the stories of real people to the fore, which I thought was very powerful. So that report was released when?
So we released that in November, on November 20th.
Yeah.
We tried to tie it in with World Ventilate Day, which was sort of always the vision, but we couldn't get the Assistant Minister to be available on the 8th of November. We launched it on the 20th of November in Parliament House in Canberra. And it was an amazing day. Like it was the best.
Yeah.
And the recording from the launch, I've watched several times. I really enjoy it.
I didn't get to see it all, actually. I got up as far as Lydia talking, but it's worth watching, actually. So if you're a bit shy about reading a report, the video's not a bad introduction to the subject as well. I think there's some really good explanations of the import of this.
Yeah.
But the report is I'll share the report in the show notes because it's a really good document that I think really, and this is I think it's of global importance. This,
Yes.
This isn't an Australia thing, is it? Yeah.
No, we're trying to make indoor air quality as an accessibility issue a global movement, because guess what? There are indoor spaces in every country. It's there are people with chronic health conditions in every country. It is something that affects everyone and everywhere. Both the report launch and the report itself were really kind of focused on the lived experience. So if you got up as far as distinguished Professor Lydia Morosco's speaking, then you would have also seen the lived experience panel. And on that panel, everybody on the panel had a PhD. It was Associate Professor Robin Schofield, who's an atmospheric scientist. And I mean, Robin's work in the early years of the pandemic were really interesting. She's based out of University of Melbourne, and she did work around kind of demonstrating that you can clear infectious aerosols from a patient room within 5.5 minutes. So her work's really interesting, but she is also someone who's living with breast cancer. So she spoke of her experience of being diagnosed with cancer and then sitting in an oncologist's office whilst he's unmasked, the CO2 levels are high, and she's sitting there thinking, this doesn't make any sense. You're seeing so many vulnerable people, you're an expert in your field, and yet you're not keeping up with the science. And an oncologist has the potential to see 20 or so vulnerable patients in a day. If he was asymptomatic or pre-symptomatically infected with anything, that could be really bad for the outcomes of any of your patients. So I thought her perspective at the launch was really interesting. And then there were two others, Hayley, who is also a board member for the Immune Deficiencies Foundation in Australia, but she's also a policy manager at the Australian Academy of Sciences. And she has been working on the Pathway to Indoor Air program alongside the Burnett Institute. So Hayley also, all of the people who we had on the lived experience panel were, were either because of their professional lives or because of their personal experience had become really interested in indoor air quality. And that's what people with chronic health conditions have had to do. They've had to learn, how do I protect myself? How do I, what tools are available? N95 masks and Aeronet CO2, I should stop, and other brands are available. There are so many kind of things that we can do, and they're all people who've been advocating for, improving indoor air quality in their workplaces, in their schools, this wasn't the first report I've written like this. This is how I've written reports for the last 15 or so years through my work with rare cancers and Marie Curie and others. Well, you tell the personal story. The personal story is how we get policy over the line, because once you understand how poor policy affects real people, you can see why you need to make a change. And so it was really the whole driver behind, sort of Safer Air Project. But we're incredibly grateful to Assistant Minister Jed Carney for her interest and her, she has really been a sort of a leading figure in the Australian government in terms of keeping indoor air quality on the policy agenda. And so we're looking forward to kind of progressing that. The report has gone to NHealth, which are a committee of the Department of Health. And we're in discussion with them around moving it forward. But as well as our kind of policy work, which I kind of see as like our top-down approach, we're also working with patient organizations to help them be safe air organizations. So how do they make sure that their offices are safe for their employees and for the patients who go there? How do they provide resources to their patients so that their high-risk communities understand the role of indoor air quality in their health? Hayley, who I mentioned, as a board member of the Immune Deficiencies Foundation, is one such organisation we've been working with. We've also been working with Emerge Australia, who look after people living with ME/CFS and now also long COVID, and also with cystic fibrosis together, who also look after people with cystic fibrosis. And it's been really interesting kind of working with these groups because they look after such high-risk communities, but those high-risk communities aren't getting information from government or from anywhere else around the role of indoor air quality in health and their health outcomes. So you see people kind of walking into the supermarkets and they're sanitizing their hands, and you know that they want, on some level, they want to protect themselves. They know they don't want to get sick, but no one's really explained yet around air.
Yeah.
And I just see it as such a massive failure that we didn't educate people. So our community support program is something that we're looking to expand this year, and I'm super excited because it just gives us such a great opportunity to reach people who really do need to know about the connection between indoor air and their health. And then the other thing, which I'm super excited about, is our kind of bit in the middle, which is our Invisible Inclusion Program, which is working with businesses. So there are two types of businesses who really understand indoor air quality, have great indoor air quality, have invested in indoor air quality because of, the productivity gains that are achievable. And there are businesses who are diversity, equity, and inclusion champions, who may or may not already have good indoor air quality. But what happens if you can combine them? What happens if you can get, we know Amazon have invested in indoor air quality across their global portfolio. What happens if you can get Amazon to start running an invisible inclusion program alongside, disability inclusion and gender inclusion, and what other
Yeah.
DEI programs they might be running. What happens if you run an invisible inclusion program alongside that investment in indoor air quality, and you can educate your staff on the role of indoor air quality and health and the role of indoor air quality and inclusion? Well, suddenly
Yeah.
we've just had a huge opportunity to create an army of employers who then go out into their communities and start advocating in their schools. Hey, why doesn't my kid have really good air quality in his classroom? Can we do something about that? We've just kind of raised the level of awareness, and I think that's what we really need to kind of move forward on. Is it's not a niche thing. We all breathe. We all breathe indoors. It should be something that it should be something that we all think about, or that we don't have to think about because it is safe. We don't think when we go to the tap and pour ourselves a glass of water, is this safe? And that's where we need to get to. We need to kind of accelerate through
Yeah.
the thinking about it to the not having to think about it phase, because we know that it's safe.
And worse than that, if we when we go to the tap and we don't think about it, when we have a drink, if we don't like the taste of it, we can
Yeah.
decide not to have a drink until a bit later on.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if anybody's tried not breathing for a couple of hours until you get home, but it doesn't end up working out very well for you.
No.
So we don't have that. I mean, and that's the thing about risk is with air quality, we don't have that choice,
Yeah.
minute to minute. We are going to breathe the air that in the room that we're in. That's just the way it's going to go.
Yeah.
So what's next? I mean, you've talked about the report is there, and that's in the machinery of government at the moment. And then, as you know, probably from lived experience, that's a slow moving machine
Yeah.
sometimes. Public awareness probably even more so to some degree, unless there's some kind of global pandemic. The people are reluctant to change quickly,
Yeah.
behaviors and habits and so on. I think the industry one's an interesting angle. I think on a number of levels, I think, yes, absolutely. If anywhere in your documentation you talk about accessibility rights in your building,
Yeah.
you've got a conversation to be had in this framing around the accessibility of your spaces to vulnerable people because of the air quality. I think that's a fascinating piece, and you may well find, as you say, certain companies will move, particularly if they have. I mean, DEI is under a bit
Yeah.
of pressure for a number of reasons at the moment, particularly in the States.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think at a fundamental level, most organisations recognise there's some level of inclusion and disability rights for employees and visitors to buildings. Another angle I think might be interesting is the money men, that particularly like here in Europe, as you know, we've got things like the EU taxonomy and ESG and non-financial reporting directive.
Yeah.
The way that assets are valued has fundamentally shifted, and the focus predominantly is on energy at the moment, but increasingly it's on its impacts to society and disability and so on. So I think there's probably an angle there as well. But within the mechanisms that value assets, if you've got an asset that's excluding parts of society from an access perspective, if that's rated, if that's understood
Yeah.
by mechanisms, that will be a powerful lever, I would have thought.
I think when you think about it from a sort of corporate real estate
Yeah.
perspective, and you think about, return to, levers that we have to sort of, drive return to the office, having an indoor air quality performance standard that demonstrates not only that the space is safe and accessible, but also that you're going to see an increased productivity from your workforce because of improved cognitive functioning, reduced absenteeism, etc. Why wouldn't there be a competitive? The corporate real estate market is competitive as it is. It's another star to add that this is a safe place, it's an accessible space, and I just think there's huge potential. If you think about daycares, right, and we kind of spoke about them briefly earlier about being petri dishes, they don't have to be. we've kind of just accepted that kids get sick in daycare because we haven't done anything to clean the air. You get these, all of this kind of hygiene theatre around wiping surfaces and cleaning toys, and I'm not saying that it's not important, but I think we could have a much bigger impact if we were cleaning the air. And if you had two daycares next to each other and one of them had a 5-star air quality rating and the other one didn't have a rating at all because which one are you going to choose to send your kid to? I'm going to send the one where my kid is likely to get sick less. I'm going to lose less work days myself. I'm going to get sick less. There's a competitive advantage to be had from moving on this and moving on it early, because it is inevitable that we will, it's inevitable. We will end up with indoor air quality performance standards because the reasons against them are, I don't know what the reasons against them are, but they're obviously,
and I think you're right. We do accept things that we shouldn't be accepting. And this hygiene theatre, this destruction of the building's microbiome with bleaches and disinfectants and additive products, is having a negative impact in one direction. Kids in preschool need to be free to lick the railings and the floors and suck on toys and spread germs that way. They will do that. That's part of building up resilience and becoming, a healthy organism. But at the same breath, if the air that you're breathing is loaded with chemicals and particulates and viruses and mold spores and so on, you can be the other direction as well. And again, we're not advocating here necessarily for additive air cleaning where we're whatevering the air to death. This is about reducing risk to a tolerable level and not creating those 3,500, 4,000 ppm environments, CO2 environments, where it's just manifestly unacceptable. I think an interesting kind of question to ask you is, like, Plum suddenly being in charge and having the levers of power at her disposal, living in the and I've spoken to you about this. You're well aware of where we are. We're in a place, and people can argue with me if they like, but let's just say, for example, we accept that 3/4 of our built environment is poorly ventilated, just as a mind game. We're not going to fix everything all at once. This isn't something where you suddenly find yourself in charge, Plum, and you go, right, by Christmas next year, all indoor spaces are going to be X. What's the game plan? Like, where do you target? Where are the high risk buildings? Where should we be thinking about accessibility first, do you think? And what does that look like in your mind? You must have thought this through, like moving towards an end goal. What does good start to look like in what spaces first?
So, I mean, in our report, we kind of set out a number of recommendations. And the first one is the recognition of indoor air quality as an accessibility issue and how it applies to the Disability Discrimination Act. In our discussion earlier, where we didn't get to was alongside the Disability Discrimination Act sits the premises standards. And the premises standards define the accessibility features and that are necessary for public spaces. Indoor air quality performance standards should naturally fit within those premises standards so that we have a standard for people to aim for. So that's number one, like just the recognition that this is an accessibility issue. The legislation already says that spaces should be safe for people with chronic health conditions. Hang on a second, we haven't thought about the role of indoor air. We should do that.
Yeah.
And then so in theory it applies to, we'll skip ahead to the bit where that's been a success and it's recognised.
Sorry to pause you there. That's where we define the equivalent of what the angle of a ramp should be and how wide it should be, and what height a button should be to open a door. That's what that building legislates. This is where we say this is what we consider, with the knowledge that we have today, as being adequate air quality to
Mhm.
allow for inclusion of
Yeah,
people with chronic health conditions, kind
yeah,
of thing.
and we'll move from adequate all the way through to good, better, best, um, all the way through to accessible. And so what is the
Yeah.
accessible standard? And that should be the highest of the high. So assuming that we've got that, there are obviously a number of settings that I think are priorities, and again, we define these in our report as being education. We have we already there's other legislation that already applies. So ignoring the Disability Discrimination Act for a second, there are legislation that apply to ensure that education environments are safe. That all children can access a safe learning environment. And those aren't just Australian standards. There's the Education Act in the UK. There's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are international and national legislation that apply to schools. Schools obviously are important because, in much like the same way we wouldn't expect a child to boil water to make it safe for them to drink, not just because they could get burnt, but because of the burden of responsibility. We can't be putting the responsibility for breathing safe air onto children. It's too much. We share the air, and therefore that has to be something that is done from a systemic level, not just an individual responsibility. It's too much to expect children to have to wear a mask. They shouldn't be responsible for that, and they should, not for their own health, but also for the health of their families. The air should be
Not
safe.
not least because it's the pointy end of the hierarchy of controls anyway. Like as an approach to protecting yourself from an environmental risk, wearing a
Yeah,
mask is literally the last thing on the list.
yeah, and yet somehow that's where we've ended up.
Yeah.
With families being told, no, you can't donate a HEPA filter. The window, in New South Wales, which is where we live in Sydney, the majority of schools are naturally ventilated. So on a day where it's too hot, too cold, too smoky, too whatever, the windows are shut, the doors are shut. So what are you left with ventilation? Nothing.
Yeah.
You've and so I mean, to your question about what are the things that I would go to first, mechanically ventilating schools would be the absolute first thing on the list, because I think you
Yeah.
could have such a huge impact on community, on the individual child and their life course. There was a paper published last week that basically showed that infections in early life, and the burden of infections in early life actually have a significant impact on health over the life course. And therefore, to the point around children got to be children, that absolutely, but actually not all of these infections are good.
No.
Most of them are not. So children have to be kept safe, but also what about the workers in the classroom? So from a workplace health and safety perspective, teachers, we know teachers are at particularly increased risk of exposure. They're at particularly increased risk of developing long COVID, as an example. Women are particularly at increased risk. These are very female-dominated workforces. And then you kind of move from education to healthcare. Healthcare settings have to be safe. It blows my mind that we do so much from from an infection prevention control perspective around hand hygiene. All of this, if you want to talk about hygiene theatre, hand hygiene, wash your hands. It's an airborne infection, but don't worry, wash your hands. It's clearly not an appropriate recommendation. We do huge amounts to reduce infections like MRSA, and when an MRSA infection occurs, we do all of this investigation to discover how did it occur, where was the failing, how do we ensure that failing doesn't occur again. And then with airborne infections, we just go, oh well, I mean, in New South Wales last year, there was data that was produced that basically showed that more than 2,000 people caught COVID in New South Wales hospitals. the people that died from those infections, they actually accounted for 14% of all COVID deaths in New South Wales last year. So 14% of people who died of COVID in New South Wales caught their infection in a healthcare setting. And I just don't understand how anyone is okay with that, and why we're not falling over ourselves to kind of immediately put a stop to the hospital-acquired infections. I mean, from my own experience, my 80-year-old aunt, had a fall last March at home in the middle of the night. She had an infection. She was delirious. She got taken to hospital by ambulance. 7 weeks later, she was still in hospital, and she acquired a COVID infection. And it just had a significant impact on her health. She was already kind of early stages of dementia. It's had a huge impact. Why are we okay with infecting our elderly or any patients in healthcare when, in fact, we can clean the air, we can use HEPA filters, we can use MERV 13 filters in ventilation, we can increase the ventilation rates, we can use UV that we have. So we have a whole suite.
And you pointed it out with classrooms, Plum, that often cleaning the air isn't something that requires somebody to make a conscious choice of in a space. All they have to do is be in that space and breathe to receive the benefits of an engineering decision that was made by somebody previously.
Yeah.
Hand washing and hygiene and all of that is a constant process, and signs up everywhere. A constant. My wife's in healthcare, and it's a constant process of awareness and training and retraining to keep people on it for that. And it is important. We know it's had massive impacts on hospital-acquired infections. Yet air quality is an engineering decision that's made once, is maintained annually probably, and takes that risk out of the equation. It's bizarre, isn't it, in that sense, that a space that should be so clued into it isn't.
And I really kind of wonder about the reasons behind that. And I don't know if you've kind of kept up with the COVID inquiry that's happening in the UK. But in module 3, which was at the end of last year, they focused on healthcare settings, and they had a number of experts provide testimony. One of whom was Professor Clive Beggs, and his testimony, which is very clear around airborne transmission, and the things that we need to do to prevent airborne transmission. And then at the same time, in the same module, you've got the IPC cell lead saying it's droplet transmission is the predominant mode, and therefore a surgical mask is just as useful as an FFP3. You've got Baroness Hallett literally sitting there with an aura, a 3M aura, and a surgical mask going, are you honestly telling me that these are the same? And it's just, I lose the words, because it's just so mind-blowing that you can have that level of denial. Of course, an FFP3 mask is more effective than a surgical mask. A surgical mask has gaping holes in it, and through those gaping holes, the air gets sucked and isn't filtered.
Yeah.
So,
and what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to clean the air and probably reduce flu, cold season, other hospital-acquired infections, maybe reduce a bit of absenteeism. Who knows, even improve some SAT scores and education scores of kids. Like, the co-benefits of this are enormous. And should and could stand on their own 2 feet just for the value that they bring. So by improving accessibility, we also happen to improve the outcomes for everybody else that's sitting in that classroom or recovering in hospital or whatever it is. It's it seems like a no-brainer in a lot of ways. But we know, and there's something about air quality. We see this with radon, actually. Radon's quite analogous to this, and radon is the slam dunkiest of slam dunks when it comes to air quality. It's one of the few air pollutants that there's very few question marks over. We know exactly how to measure it. We know exactly the impacts it has on public health. It can't be mistaken for anything else. It doesn't transmit in any other way. We know exactly where it comes from. And the cost to society is large. Yet, as a human species, we'll do almost anything to ignore it. To the
Sounds just
point
like
that
COVID.
it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And study, the friend of mine, James McGrath, who's been on the podcast, talks about studies where they were giving, in a high radon area, giving radon tests away, analogous to, it's just, I can imagine you like, it's like, yeah, giving the tests away for free, and people going, no thanks. And when they did the studies, they had a street, 20, 30 homes, all with high levels of radon. So few people took the test that they had a load of money left over, so they offered free remediation to people with high radon. Half the people didn't want it. And you can argue it's something about radioactivity or some weird psychological something or other, but it's just this. A lot of the risk of air quality is so esoteric in nature and hard to explain, and often chronic and long term in its nature. The acute impacts of things like carbon monoxide and COVID and stuff aside, but the most of it is long term. That somehow we seem to just be able to kick it into the long grass mentally as a species. It's not a risk. We seem to have found a way of framing in a way that creates action. And I think that's what's interesting again about this angle of accessibility, that it brings it to the fore in a bite-sized chunk way, where we're saying, we're not leaning on fluffy kind of cognitive benefit questionnaire outcome type scenarios. This is just a fundamental fairness thing. There's a bunch of people who can't get access to buildings because they're not fit for purpose. Sort it out. Oh, and by the way, it fixes a load of stuff for everybody else as well as a co-benefit. It's quite a nice way of doing it, because it stops us having to think about this at a population-wide level, and can get us to think about the personal story, the individual, that this is a building for a human that isn't being given the foundations for life, whether that's education or recovery or end-of-life care or whatever it is that they deserve, because of something as menial as somebody couldn't be asked to spend money on a fan. It kind of, boils it down to that basic nature, doesn't it? And that's just unfair. And as a human species, that triggers us. Like, fairness is a thing for us. I just had Jack Harvey Clark's on the podcast as this goes live, probably a few weeks ago, and we talk about that with noise in the podcast as well, that one of the triggers for poor health and poor health outcomes with noise is the feeling of unfairness. If I feel that I'm in an unfair position, that not only has a mental health effect, but it has a physical health effect on us. So fairness is an important trigger, I think, and I think the accessibility thing is a nice window into that, because regardless of the esoteric global population benefits of air quality, blah blah blah, this is just unfair on John down the road who can't go to school because the school's ventilation's shit. Like, sort it out.
Why should John be the person carrying the burden of responsibility to make sure he doesn't get sick with something that could put him in hospital? Why should John bear the responsibility of not killing his parent who has a chronic? It's huge. And I mean, there's a quote. I like hearing Lydia talk about. It's our fundamental right to have access to clean air. And I really couldn't agree more. It really does come down to, are we okay to exclude this person, this group of people, which isn't a small percentage of the population, from safe access? Are we okay with this group of people or this person having to bear the burden of responsibility for keeping themselves safe? For so many years, I've sort of, every time a birthday party invitation comes in for the kids, like, okay, well, where is it? Is it outdoors? Great, it's outdoors. Yes, we can go to this one. Oh no, this one's at the really poorly ventilated bowling alley. No, we're not going to that one. And it's just,
Yeah.
it's really exhausting, to have to kind of make those individual risk assessments on every single thing that we do. Can the kids go to the school excursion? Well, it's a 45-minute drive away. It's going to be on a bus. The CO2 will be awful. I guess I'll be driving them there again. It shouldn't come down to individuals to have to make those decisions, and especially for kids, where they're decisions where they become excluded, they become a target for bullying. It's hard enough being a kid. It's even harder to be a kid that's different. And for kids wearing masks to protect themselves. Even my daughter Alice, she gets bullied for, why didn't you come on the bus? I didn't come on a bus because mum's a real meanie, and she won't let me get on a bus where the CO2 is over 8,000. Gosh, she's so boring. It's just, it shouldn't come. It just shouldn't be a thing. The ventilation on the bus should be excellent. Ventilation on the bus should also be good because of the cognitive functioning of the driver. I don't want to
quite frankly, I don't want a driver driving 32 kids with CO2 levels at 6,000 ppm. Thank you very much.
It's and for the driver, it's
Co-benefit.
yeah. And for a driver, it's a workplace health and safety issue as well. Not just because he could be a bit drowsy, but because he could be infected, and that could lead to time off. So it's just, there are so many benefits. There are so many arguments for why. There are so few arguments against, and yet we still face these barriers. And I really hope we can crash through those barriers with the way that I kind of first started thinking about accessibility and this problem was as it being a chink in the armor. It's a crack that we should in theory be able to pry
get something in there
open.
and
and just like crack the whole thing open. Because, I mean, you and I have spoken before about healthy buildings. What better thing than to champion accessible buildings, healthy and safe and inclusive? And then everybody starts thinking about, so much of the advice that we see, and even the state of Victoria here, as are still very good on their advice around COVID. And there was something that they put out this week. Meet outdoors. And then there are things like, wear a mask if you're going to be seeing people who are vulnerable. How do you know? How do you know if someone is vulnerable? My husband doesn't walk around, with a big sticker on his chest saying, I have chronic kidney disease. I don't walk around with a thing saying, I have really severe long COVID. People don't walk around, with a thing saying, I have cystic fibrosis, I have cancer. It's very difficult. These are invisible health conditions, invisible disabilities. And this is sort of goes back to kind of our invisible inclusion program. It's called the invisible inclusion program because the disabilities are invisible, but the solution is also invisible, and that I think is why it's such a tough problem for people to kind of.
But the one thing we can do is make spaces safer. I made a note when you were talking earlier, and it was an interesting proposition to put to you. I talked about the fact that so much of our built environment probably underperforms in the first instance, and I said, we even bringing buildings to adequate would solve a lot. And you were saying, well, we could bring them to good and better and best.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to imagine when you said that what that might look like. But in many environments, places like schools and healthcare facilities, the standards for flow rates and air change rates in those
Mhm.
spaces can be pretty high anyway. So
Mhm.
often the standards that we have, I mean, I know a lot of them have been developed for comfort and, odors, and, we
Yeah.
can argue that the flow rates are way too low, and,
Mm.
things like ASHRAE 241 has tried to address that. But in a lot of spaces, the flow rates aren't far off, where
Mhm.
they need to be to significant, because there is, with infection risk, and a friend and colleague of mine, Ben Jones, would argue this very strongly, that there is a law of diminishing returns when it
Yeah.
comes to infection risks, and we can't just keep turning up the dial forever. There are
Yeah.
consequences of ventilating at 32 air changes an hour, right? Um, but even at some of the standards we already have, that adequate or good air quality is not bad. I mean, it would
Yeah.
significantly reduce the risk.
Yeah.
So in this roadmap to moving buildings from poorly ventilated, naturally ventilated classrooms where they're shut at winter or shut in summer, or wherever you live in the world
Yeah.
that causes you to close them down, the reality is those rooms are sitting at a tenth, a quarter, a third, whatever it is of what they should be.
Mhm.
Um, so even getting it to the minimum is pretty good.
Yeah.
What's your kind of view on that? When you start to look around at some of the standards and guidance that you're seeing for infection risk,
Mhm.
does that give you some confidence that there are some mechanisms there to start thinking about our built environment from an infection risk perspective?
Yeah, definitely. And I think ASHRAE 241 is a really great example of setting, I guess, setting a standard. But what we really need is a performance standard, isn't it? Like we need something to, how is this building performing right now, today?
Yeah.
Not at a point in time. The thing about, and we did a lot of consultation, like when we were writing our report, we did a lot of consultation with, with a number of experts, and I'm super grateful, to so many, people. I describe myself as an amateur indoor air quality enthusiast. I really only kind of started thinking about indoor air quality 5 years ago. So I'm really grateful, for the expertise of people who've been thinking about this for a lot longer than I have. And what we kind of, where we got to in the consultation with our report is, we needed performance standards. ASHRAE 241 effectively sets a safe standard. What we need is a performance standard to get that to apply in real time. The conversations that our position as an organization has always been that infection risk management mode should apply at all times and in all places, because at any given time you could have someone who's at significantly increased risk of poor health outcomes following exposure to airborne pathogens or airborne pollutants. So it isn't just about, a pandemic being declared and the risk there being, this significantly increased risk. That significantly increased risk can occur at any time for a person who has a chronic health condition if they're exposed to someone who's infectious with flu or SARS or, or whatever it is. So infection risk management mode effectively should be a standard that we're always seeking. And of course, the other problem of waiting for a pandemic to be declared is the horse has bolted. So, we don't want to be waiting until, community transmission is so high that suddenly we go, oh, hold on, let's quickly turn our buildings onto infection risk management mode. Let's actually be proactive and avoid the infections that occur before that mode gets implemented. So 241 at all times in all public spaces, and it is effectively what we're sort of seeking. And you don't have to do that by kind of turning up the ventilation, the outdoor ventilation, so that it's pumping through outdoor air and causing your energy use to skyrocket. We can do it with filtration and UV and other technologies. Kind of a Swiss cheese type approach that's bespoke to the setting. In terms of where is a New South Wales classroom sitting right now on the spectrum of good, better, best? When the with
Yeah.
the with the windows closed, it's it's pretty shocking. I think you've also got, obviously, Professor Morosko, published the blueprint for mandating indoor air quality standards in March last year, which really kind of set 4 parameters: CO2, PM2.5, and ventilation rates. And they were very clear in that report that jurisdictions could lower or raise the thresholds that they had set. And so, in consultation with her through the writing of our report, where we landed was 241 as the this is how you create a safe indoor space that protects occupants from exposure to airborne pathogens. Use the parameters from that blueprint to set a performance standard and create an accessible indoor air quality performance standard that effectively reduces the risk of exposure to pathogens to the lowest practicable level. And I think if we do that, we will have such an impact, not just on COVID, on flu, on RSV, on measles, on on all of these infectious diseases, current diseases and future variants. If H5N1 in the US takes off, wouldn't it be nice that we already had indoor air quality standards that mean that actually it's got nowhere to go?
Yeah.
Because actually those trains of transmission just don't occur in the first place. There's always a kind of discussion in the kind of the immunocompromised community around short range and long range transmission. Obviously, implementing indoor air quality standards that effectively lower the risk of exposure to airborne pathogens is about far field transmission. And you'll never really kind of do anything for, N95 masking is the only real way to, prevent near field transmission, and really is why N95 masking in healthcare should be the standard. But in schools, we're never going to, we don't want masks. Let's use the engineering controls that we have to ensure that the far field transmission isn't occurring. And when the far field transmission isn't occurring, actually the R number will decrease significantly. That actually your chance of exposure to someone who's infectious will also be lowered, and therefore the near field transmission risk decreases too.
Yeah.
So we can crack both nuts with indoor air quality. So for people who kind of argue to that, I still think there's potential to reduce that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a fabulous position to be in, to be having the kind of vaccine conversation where you'd reduced the risk significantly enough where people were questioning whether or not it's worth taking a vaccine or not. They had that, they're in the luxurious position of thinking they don't have to worry about polio or something like that, that our indoor spaces were safe enough that we do manage to reduce pandemics and infection risks in communities and so on, to the point where people are going, well, is it really worth it? That's a good position to be in, to get that far down the road. I mean, in a way, and I have this conversation a lot with housing organisations, this is about, with a lot of risks, and anybody that's kind of filled in a risk assessment form kind of knows this mental space you get into. A lot of things with risks is just being able to park something and say, yes, I've done what I need to there. Now I can worry about the other stuff. Because let's be frank, if you're somebody with chronic health conditions, you've got far more important things to be worrying about than the building that you're going into. This is about being able to park that problem. This is something you shouldn't have to be thinking about. So the goal here is to check that box and frankly move on to something else, because
100%.
This is an engineering problem that if we solve it, we can worry about the next engineering problem. The problem here isn't that there aren't solutions, it's the scale of the problem that I think is the fundamental blocker. That anybody with any understanding of their sector looks into their sector and goes, Jesus, where do I start? that I don't have any money anyway. Like, how do
Yeah,
I fix that problem? Because any one of those sectors, how your healthcare, education,
yeah,
residential care, they've got enough battles to be fighting. Never mind having to fundamentally shift a large swathe of their built environment up a gear. And again, I go back to maybe that's the magic of the accessibility thing. A bit like we faced with accessibility with as accessibility for wheelchairs and things a decade or two ago.
mm,
That we just need to start.
yes,
We gotta figure out where the risky environments are, start there, and get going. That there are targets, that there are rules, that by 2030 all schools or wherever, you start figuring out
yeah,
what that roadmap looks like, and you start mapping it out.
yeah.
You know,
There's a good analogy, and it works because it's already in every room, in every public space, is fire and smoke detectors.
yeah,
At some point, a decision was made. Like, oh my god, this is a huge problem. We've really got to do something, about fire safety. We can't have buildings burning down. That creates quite a health risk. And at some point, fire detectors and smoke detectors were put in every single room in every single public space, in people's homes as well. And it was determined that actually we need to do this. Why is it therefore a kind of a mental hurdle to leap over to say we should have an air quality monitor in every public room, in every public space? So
yeah.
we're not just measuring for smoke, we're
Yeah, and more
measuring
than
for.
that, if you build buildings, I mean, I was involved in building an office building there a few years ago. Not only do we recognise that we need smoke alarms and detectors in every building, but we also make allowances for people with disabilities in the provision of that equipment, where we have phones that people that are disabled can ring to a particular point in the building so the fire service knows where
Yeah,
they are to come and get them. That lights, and there's braille, and there's stuff for people with visual impairments. You have to have flashing lights so people that can't hear an
yeah,
alarm know, like we figured that problem out. Like this
yeah.
this again, it's just an engineering
Mhm,
problem. And
mhm.
and I would imagine that we're killing far more people a year with air quality than we were killing them with buildings burning down.
Yeah. And so
You
there's
know,
another really good analogy is smoking. Smoking being banned in indoor public spaces. I don't know where it's got to in Europe and in the UK, but also in Australia, you also cannot smoke outdoors in a restaurant as well as indoors because of the risk for hospitality workers being exposed while working, serving in those outdoor areas. So as well as the fire stuff, we've already taken steps on preventing exposure to secondhand smoke indoors and outdoors because we recognise that the risk is great. There are other examples around drink driving. I find drink driving to be a really interesting one because the risk isn't just to the drunk driver, to harm themselves, but the drunk driver can also cause harm to others. So, the infectious person isn't just causing harm to themselves, doesn't just have the opportunity to cause harm to their own health, but they can cause harm to others. And I
yeah,
and I think that there are so many different ways that when we just because we share air, once you start thinking about that and the role of our shared responsibilities and our responsibility for the health of others, and you start thinking, okay, well, hang on a second, this creates this accessibility challenge because everybody should be able to access these shared spaces without risk of permanent harm, short term, long term harm. Um, then well, we've already acted on so many other issues that are very similar. What are we waiting for in terms of making our shared air safer for everyone to breathe?
yeah. And what you're fundamentally talking about is creating great spaces anyway.
Yeah,
You know, that this isn't creating an environment that's somehow going to be an impediment to normal people, quote unquote.
Yeah,
You know, the others here aren't imposing something that requires you, you know, I don't know, to figure out how to open the door now that opens automatically for disabled. Like, do I press the button? Do I, you know, there's none of that. You're walking into spaces that are just going to have good quality air in them. Like,
yeah,
who doesn't want that anyway? So, like, there's this fabulous, you know, for forcing this through and helping get this through, you get the benefit of your kid going into a classroom who's might actually get a better test result
yeah,
because the teacher isn't absent as much and she
yeah,
gets more consistency in the teaching. You've got kids that are concentrating better. And, you know, we all understand the 3.5, 3.5, 3:30 slump in the afternoon in a
yeah.
classroom. Like, you look at the CO2 levels, we now understand why that is.
I,
Um,
I, I always laugh about that because when I was doing my master's in London in public health, I studied at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'd go to the gym at lunchtime, and then I'd come back for the afternoon lecture, and I'd always have a sleep. In this one lecture theatre, I always had a sleep, and I was like,
yeah,
what is wrong with me? Why do I God, I must be really
yeah,
tired. And actually now I'm like, oh, maybe it wasn't me. Maybe it was just that the room was really stuffy,
yeah.
and that it was leading me to, have a sleep.
Unfortunately, I think it's also something to do with the body clock. The three and a
Yeah,
half, three, half three, 4 o'clock slump. There's a cycle thing. Something about because you sleep at the deepest at that kind
yeah,
of time at night. It's a thing. But
more
yeah, no,
coffee needed.
absolutely. Um, what what can people do, Plum, to support your work locally in
Yeah.
Australia, but also more broadly internationally? Like, obviously, you've got the website and the
Mhm.
report. What are you looking for from the community more broadly to help push this issue of accessibility in the built
I
environment?
mean, ultimately, we're on a mission to get indoor air quality recognised as an accessibility and inclusion issue. We want people, working in indoor air quality to start talking about it in those terms. You know, imagine, you know, I kind of, I imagine a day where there's a star rating system. You walk into Woolworths, which is one of the shopping centres here in Australia, and there's a rainbow sticker on the door. Next to that sticker should be a safe air badge, that says this is, and the live CO2 and PM 2.5 monitoring that shows people this is a safe space, making the invisible visible and bringing indoor air quality as an accessibility issue forward. I think will have a huge impact on general public awareness, the ability for businesses who have great air quality to start talking about their air quality from an accessibility perspective. You mentioned earlier about businesses wanting to be inclusive employers. Most businesses do want to be inclusive employers. So for those who are already committed to being an inclusive employer, because they know that there are benefits to be had, not just for them but for their staff, start to, and if you've got good indoor air quality, start putting the two together, or come and talk to us, and we will help you do that, because not only can it make your workplace more accessible and more inclusive and more productive, but it can also help drive a broader conversation around the air that we share and how we can make indoor air safe for everyone. And that's really that's our vision. Create a world where
Yeah.
everyone can breathe safely indoors. So we're really, if it resonates, with your listeners, do get in touch, because it's not just an Australian thing. It's an everyone everywhere problem. And
Yeah.
I know that it's a solvable problem as well. This is the sort of the funny thing. I wish I'd been able to put the idea of, hey, why don't you found a charity? I wish I'd been able to put that as an idea back into the box. It would have been an awful lot simpler. But actually the reality is the solution is so obvious. It's so achievable that why don't we just kind of get on and do it, and then move
Yeah.
forwards?
Yeah.
And go back, for the person living with cancer, not have to worry about picking up an infection, just go back to worrying about, I'm going to beat my cancer. And not have to worry about the fact, oh goodness, now I'm severely immunocompromised, and it doesn't make any sense that we should be adding.
And risk management is a journey. So, and to coin a famous pandemic term for the topic of this podcast, letting perfection be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
You've got a multi-story building. Start with one floor. Have one floor that's safe for visitors and workers that are vulnerable. If that's all you can do, understand. I was just trying to think of analogies while you were talking there, but it's like having a purpose-built bus for accessibility for wheelchair users. Great if you've got one, but if you don't, have some ramps in the bus that can get somebody on if they need to, or a protocol that people understand how and when to get the right bus or whatever it is. Like, there are all sorts of ways of providing accessibility that don't have to be perfect. We can start and we can make an impact on our built environment that doesn't require us to start from scratch every time. We can think about what, once we understand the problem, we can start to think in ways to mitigate. And I love risk for that, because it's not a black and white binary problem to solve. It's something that's a journey. It's something that we have to apply common sense to and understand the nuance of where we are and where we've got to get to, and the skills and the resources that we have available and so on. But it starts with sitting down, recognizing that represents a risk, and putting plans in place to mitigate it. That's all you've got to do, and just start that process. And it just gets lumped in with all of the other things you've got to do for managing risk in your buildings. But it needs to be a line item. That's the starting point, doesn't it? It has to make it on there somewhere in your annual risk review of your buildings and your assets, is accessibility as a result of air quality, and figure out where you are.
I mean, if you even go back from it as an accessibility risk for businesses making the risk assessment of, hang on a second, how come all of my staff are maxing out all of their sick leave now?
Yeah.
Well, that's a risk. It's a risk to a business. How do we solve that? Because we're losing so many work days to people being sick, whether they're sick because of something they've acquired in the office, or they're sick because they're caring for their children who've picked up something at school. How come everyone is now using all their sick leave? And we're seeing that in Australia. We're seeing huge increases in sick leave. And I know the data in the UK and the US is increasing on that as well. So how do we as an organisation reduce the risk of increased sick leave? Well, we can reduce it by improving the quality of the air that we breathe in the office, but we can also reduce it by improving our sick leave policies, where we encourage people to stay home when they are sick, so that they don't come into the office and infect others, and then have ongoing transmission cycles that have a bottom line impact, because actually you've got everybody taking sick leave. There are so many things that we can do, and there are so many ways in which the risk appears.
And we can have an incremental
the only thing we really have to do is pull our head out of the sand and say we have the ability to do something about this. We just need to stop ignoring it.
Yeah. And it all starts with a conversation. Plum, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you, and absolutely fascinating. One of the things I love about doing this podcast is perspectives. And this has been a refreshing one, and an eye-opening one for me personally, and has got me, pretty much everybody I've spoken to since I last spoke to you has had accessibility shoved down their throats ad nauseum. So it's had an impact on me, and hopefully an impact on the listeners, and just get them to just view that built environment through that lens and have a think about it. I think it's quite transformative in that way, that it's a perspective that resonates with people, and surprisingly hasn't been thought of before. So I wish you all the luck with it. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And if listeners want to find out more, I'll provide some show notes and links and stuff in the comments below. So Plum, thanks a million. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks, Simon. It's been awesome talking to you, and thanks for your interest in what we're doing. You know, it's really exciting to spread the word about this as an accessibility issue, because it really is something that affects all of us. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you enjoyed the podcast and know someone else who might be interested, do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And do check out the YouTube channel by the same name and subscribe if you can, as there will be additional content posted here quite regularly. This podcast was brought to you in partnership with ACO, Ultra Protect, Imbiate and Erico, all great companies who share the vision of this podcast. Your support of them helps their support of the show. Do check them out in the links and at airqualitymatters.net. See you next week.